So my name's Brad Duchaine. I introduced myself in the morning session, but I think some of people weren't here in the morning session. I'm a professor at Dartmouth College now, but up till a year ago, I was over at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at UCL, which is when Martin and I began the collaboration that sort of resulted in today's day. Today, what I'm going to talk about is a fairly general talk about developmental prosopagnosia. There have been several nice talks about treatment, but I'm going to talk sort of more generally about it. And some of you may be familiar with this guy's photograph here on the screen here. I put him up here because in a lot of ways Bill certainly was one of the most important people in terms of raising public awareness of developmental prosopagnosia. He created this website, Faceblind. I think it was 1996 or 1997. And at the time, there was very little information out there about what it was like to be a developmental prosopagnosic and even what it was. And Bill wrote this long, extended website. In fact, he calls it a book. I just discussed his experiences with face processing. So it's been a fantastic resource for prosopagnosics for now 14 or 15 years. And I ended up writing my dissertation on Bill's face processing. And so he's been a real important guy for me, too. So neuropsychology is the study of people who have deficits following brain damage or else deficits due to some other cause, in the case that we're talking about today here, developmental deficits. And neuropsychology has been a field that people have studied for, let's say, 150 years, roughly. And so just looking at selective deficits that follow brain damage. And neuropsychological patients have been studied many times. You do want to know about the condition, but there's a lot that you can learn about the organization of the brain by studying what sort of selective deficits can result from brain damage or from developmental problems. Now, if you imagine that the brain is composed of hundreds of different mechanisms, maybe even thousands of different mechanisms, that suggests that there could be all kinds of different neuropsychological conditions that could exist. And we've seen that lesions can have very selective effects. My guess is, in terms of neuropsychology, we've really just seen the tip of the iceberg. It was only 10 years ago, of course, that we even realized that lots of people had face recognition problems. So if you imagine other conditions, which are much less salient to people who have these conditions, it's likely that there are hundreds of these conditions out there that we're not aware of. Or that's my guess, anyway. So just to give you an example of some of these selective deficits, so this is a scotoma. So if somebody suffered damage to an area called V1 in the back of their brain here, it was just affecting a certain part of V1, you might lose a small bit of your visual field like you see in red there. If you lost a larger bit, well, then you could lose a whole quadrant, and you could have hemianopia. If you lost even more of V1, you could lose half of it. And of course, you could lose all of V1 as well. You could have no visual field at all. But this is an example, low-level vision, looking at the sort of selective deficits that one can have. Now, if you move a little higher in the visual system, people have deficits affecting color perception. And so there are people, of course, not of course, but there are people who lose color perception entirely. Form vision is normal. Other people, though, just lose half of their color perception for just one side of the visual field. Others even sometimes will lose it just in a particular quadrant. And so we're seeing real specificity in these sorts of deficits. There's a condition called akinetopsia in which people have motion deficits. So they don't perceive motion normally. Other aspects of their visual world are normal, though. And so if we move just a little bit higher up in the visual system, then we get to prosopagnosia. And so now we're not talking about an elementary property of perception like motion or color, but now we're talking about a particular category of object out there in the world that people have difficulty processing. And just a little background on acquired prosopagnosia. The first report, at least what you see people citing, the first report that people are aware of was Wigan, who was a neurologist here in London, reported someone in 1844 who had difficulty recognizing faces following, I'm not sure what exactly the brain damage was, but following some sort of brain damage. There were a number of other case reports, late 19th century, early 20th century, about acquired prosopagnosia. And then Hoff and Poltz, two German neurologists, argued in 1937 that we should consider these sorts of face deficits that we're seeing a specific type of agnosia. It's affecting just face processing, or what I should say is it can just affect face processing. Often people who have prosopagnosia also have trouble with object recognition as well, but you sometimes see selective cases. Now, that was an argument that was very similar to one Bodemer made, but Bodemer had the genius to come up with a term for the condition. And so he was the guy who came up with the term prosopagnosia. And he did that in 1947 in a study with 3 people who'd suffered head wounds in World War II, and 2 of these people were prosopagnosic. And he argued there's really some sort of specific neural machinery that's used to process faces. And so he came up with that term there, prosopon, the Greek word for face, along with agnosia. Agnosia is a term that just meaning ignorance is a term that Freud actually coined in the late 19th century. So that's acquired prosopagnosia, but in recent years, people have started investigating what I call selective developmental disorders. And so people have been looking at these people who seem to suffer neuropsychological deficits very similar to what you see in people with acquired conditions, and yet they don't have any history of brain damage. And these impairments can be just as severe as those that you see in acquired cases. And there's probably a whole lot of different ways that development can be disrupted. So you could have genetic problems, you could have lesions maybe before birth, there could be some sort of atypical early experience. So when we're talking about developmental conditions, we often really don't know anything about what's causing them. And there's probably a lot of different causes, even when the conditions look similar in terms of the deficits that people have. So there have been a couple of these selective developmental dissociations, deficits, that have been studied for a long time. So dyslexia is one of these, and another one is dysgraphia. And this isn't surprising. Dysgraphia affects one's ability to write. And so dyslexia and dysgraphia disrupt school activities. And so it's not surprising that they've received a lot of attention. Of course, there's been a lot of funding to look into these conditions. But within... This used to happen to me when I lectured at Birkbeck, too. Okay, there we go. So in recent years, though, people have realized that there are a lot of other selective developmental deficits. And I put synesthesia up here. I don't know if it really fits, because there's not really a deficit in synesthesia. You might think of it as extra connections between brain areas. But the other ones are conditions. So amusia affects music, dyscalculia affects numerical abilities, topographical disorientation, which a lot of people with prosopagnosia affects navigation. You might also think of some psychiatric conditions as selective developmental deficits as well. Ones that we don't understand what sort of cognitive mechanisms are not functioning right, but it may be that some psychiatric conditions sort of fit under the same rubric. And then lastly, prosopagnosia. And so I just wanted to give you a little discussion sort of where prosopagnosia fits in among these other neuropsychological conditions. And just a little history on developmental prosopagnosia itself. So the first report was a paper published in Cortex in 1976 by McConaughey. And this was on a person named A.B. And A.B. was a girl. She was 12 years old at the time. They ran her through a number of tasks. She did poorly on these tasks. It wasn't absolutely clear that she didn't bomb out with everything, you might think she would. But she did poorly on a number of tasks, and it was clear that in daily life she had difficulty recognizing faces. Interestingly, and they didn't follow up, they didn't collect any data on it, but A.B.'s mother also reported that she had difficulty recognizing faces, suggesting there might be some sort of family connection here with prosopagnosia. So that was 1976. Then there weren't any reports in the 1980s on developmental prosopagnosia. So it looked like it was an extremely rare condition. There's just this one AB. Well, who knows what went on with AB? Maybe she had some brain damage very early on in life that nobody picked up upon. Maybe developmental prosopagnosia doesn't even exist. There was a follow-up study done with AB in 1991 that confirmed her difficulties with faces even more. And then there were a couple other reports in the 90s. And so that's where we were at the end of the 90s, and I'd mentioned this earlier in the morning. There had just been a handful of cases reported, so it appeared to be an extremely rare condition. But it was about this time that prosopagnosics, they didn't wait around for researchers. They started finding themselves. And there was an email group that was put together by Bill Shozer, who I mentioned there in my first slide, a guy named Glenn Alperin. Glenn's just outside of Boston. There was a guy named Pertti Tappala, who was in Finland. And somehow these guys found each other in the early days of the internet and started up an email group just discussing what it was like to be prosopagnosic. And then about that same time is when Bill and Glenn each posted their own site about what it was like to be prosopagnosic. So this is a really important sort of landmark event in the history of prosopagnosia. Now, I was lucky enough to stumble into prosopagnosia. I was running experiments on just normal college students, and I really knew the neuropsychological literature quite well. So my experiments were motivated by questions that arose from neuropsychology. I was just running them on college students, and they weren't going anywhere. In fact, they didn't work. But right about this time that I was realizing these experiments were totally failing, I made contact through a family friend with a boy who was 17 who was prosopagnosic, a developmental prosopagnosic. He was down in Los Angeles. I was in Santa Barbara at the time, so I just put my computers into the car and drive down there and test him. And after testing him a bit, he was clearly prosopagnosic. Then I was able to start testing Bill Shozer as well. Bill was up in San Francisco. I wrote my dissertation on Bill. And during that time, I tested a few other people as well. Because I created a website during grad school just talking about what I did, people with prosopagnosic started finding me. Then I moved out to Harvard to do a postdoc, and along with Ken Nakayama, we created this web page that's kind of embarrassing. It hasn't really changed much in 10 years at all. But this is the website that we created here, faceblind.org. And it was a website that discussed information about prosopagnosia, and it also provided prosopagnosics with a way to contact us if they were interested in research participation. And of course, many of you did just that. You filled out our contact form, and then we got in touch with you. And since that time, so now we've heard, I think I mentioned it earlier, we've heard from about 6,000 people through that website over the last 10 years. And the numbers keep increasing every year, so I suspect this year we'll hear from 1,000 or probably more. And there's going to be there's going to be a documentary in the States that's going to feature Joe, actually, as one of the 4 prosopagnosics on 60 Minutes, probably later this fall, which is going to be a real good boost again for public awareness. So the word's getting out there slowly. I'm still surprised how many people I meet, though, who've never heard of it. Of course, I think about it, every 5 minutes. But there's still a long way to go. So maybe I should skip over these because I don't have that much time, actually. You've heard all these sorts of quotes before. There's the daycare sort of quote that somebody mentioned earlier. Oh, so when I was here in the UK still, Sarah Bate and I applied for a grant to look into prosopagnosia in children. And fortunately, we got it funded. And Sarah, though, got a job, so she didn't end up, and I moved too, so we didn't end up working on it together. But fortunately, ESRC doesn't, I don't even know that they know that I've left. And I've got a postdoc over there at Dartmouth working on this grant right now, developing tests for children. And just give you a feel for some of the difficulties that kids have, because I think this is one of the real big issues. So this person says, teachers often ask my son to pass out graded homework, would send him to deliver messages to specific people, ask him about schoolwork outside of the classroom, etc., all of which were very confusing, humiliating, stressful, and or embarrassing for him. So you can imagine it. Well, I don't need to tell you to imagine, but people with prosopagnosia don't want to hand out papers in class. Here's another mother. She says, prosopagnosia explains why Joey has never been able to recognize neighbors, friends, family members. It explains why Joey, my warm, friendly little boy, has only been able to make it one friend at a time. It explains why out of his preschool class, the only child he ever knew by name was Abby, the Chinese girl, the only non-Caucasian child in the class. And this mother here, it took her a long time to realize that Joey was prosopagnosic, because of course, as a mother, if you're not familiar with prosopagnosia, it's just not something that you even consider. Might explain, you think your child's shy, you think they don't like people, you think something else. You don't think it's a problem with the visual system. And so it's very difficult for parents to pick out unless they're prosopagnosic themselves. Prosopagnosia can have quite significant psychosocial effects. So we collaborated with Lucy Yardley and some of her students down at Southampton a few years ago to look at this. Now, these are things that all prosopagnosics are probably aware of, but so first, many DPs fail to recognize their prosopagnosia. Bill, who I had on the first page there, didn't figure out he was prosopagnosic till his late 40s. He's a smart guy. He's got a law degree. He went to MIT. Still took him till his late 40s. He was standing around or sitting around watching television with friends, and he said, you know, I just wish they wouldn't have so many headshots during these shows because, you know, I have no idea who that person is once they zoom in on him like that. And his friends kind of looked at him like, you know, what are you talking about? And they got to talking about it, and he realized that, you know, everybody else can recognize those images of faces, whereas he can't. So prosopagnosics often attribute their difficulties with sort of person recognition. They don't know it's face recognition, of course, to stupidity, laziness, absence of interest in others. We've heard all this earlier today. And many feel quite guilty, and then when they do learn about prosopagnosia, they have what you guys have talked about, what I call the prosopagnosia epiphany. You sort of realize all of a sudden, this is it. So I get a lot of emotional emails from people who are really thrilled to read about prosopagnosia and learn sort of because it explains so many things for them. Now, sort of in terms of specific psychosocial effects, in this study that we did, we found that prosopagnosics have elevated levels of anxiety, which isn't surprising. If you don't know who you're dealing with, of course you're going to be anxious in those situations. The one weakness in that study was that we were using a self-selected sample. So we were looking at people who had come to our website to report their difficulties with face recognition. You can imagine that people who report their difficulties with face recognition might simply be more anxious people. And so we're now doing a follow-up study where we're going to look at different sorts of anxiety, social anxiety being one, and anxiety in other situations as well. My expectation is that prosopagnosics are going to show elevated anxiety in social situations, but look just like control subjects in those other ones. So that'll demonstrate that it's not just generalized anxiety that prosopagnosics have because of this self-selected sample. Prevalence, we've talked a little about this, so I won't go over it much. There was a German study that suggested it might be 2.5%. They did a follow-up study in Hong Kong that suggested 1.8%. In collaboration with some people at Harvard, we came up with a figure of about 2% from large sampling online. It's difficult to know exactly what the percentage is, and it really doesn't matter. There is no true percentage out there because, of course, it's always going to depend on exactly what you draw the line. This is prosopagnosia, this isn't. What's clear, though, is there are a lot of people out there who have face recognition difficulties. It's very common if I give a talk to a room not full of prosopagnosics, but just a room of academics, say, somebody will come up to me after the talk and will tell me about all kinds of experiences that they've had that sound very atypical. Often when we've had a chance to test these people, sure enough, they are prosopagnosic. So there are an awful lot of people out there who have difficulties recognizing faces that really affect them in day-to-day life. Whether you want to call it prosopagnosia, that doesn't really matter to me. What's important is they have problems recognizing faces. So if there are a lot of people, there should be some famous prosopagnosics, and many of you are probably familiar with some of these people. So Jane Goodall might be the best example of a famous prosopagnosic. And in the preface to her book, she discussed it here. She said, I used to think it was due to some mental laziness, and I tried desperately to memorize the faces of people. Sometimes I knew that people were upset when I did not immediately recognize them. Certainly I was. And because I was embarrassed, I kept it to myself. Interestingly, Jane reports that her sister is also prosopagnosic as well. You had a PM about 100 years ago who appears to have been prosopagnosic. Here's a quote from, there were a lot of stories about his difficulty recognizing faces, but once standing behind the throne at a court ceremony, he noticed a young man smiling at him. Who's my young friend, he whispered to a neighbor. Your eldest son, the neighbor replied. So I think that certainly qualifies. Chuck Close has been out in the media a lot over the last couple of years discussing his prosopagnosia, which is very interesting given that Chuck Close, paints these giant portraits of faces. This is a self-portrait that he did here. And of course, Oliver Sacks has been talking a lot over the last 9 months or so about prosopagnosia because he's been promoting a book which has a chapter about prosopagnosia, and in particular about his difficulties with prosopagnosia. He also wrote a nice article in the New Yorker that came out in August of last year. Yeah, 2010. Let's see. See if that's supposed to be there. Oh yeah, well, okay, this just makes the point. I don't know that I have these in exactly the right order, but so prosopagnosia affects face processing, but as I mentioned, with acquired cases and developmental cases, a fair amount of prosopagnosics have difficulty recognizing objects as well. So they might have trouble finding a car in a car park. They might have trouble recognizing a house when they see it again. And this is just data from a family. So each one of these is an individual. So this is a female, age 39. You can see the rest of her siblings there. All of them are bad with faces. Turned out both the parents are terrible with faces too. So they're a very interesting family in that regard. There are 8 siblings, 2 parents, and an uncle who are all prosopagnosic. But anyway, this shows how they do on face tests. And you can consider any score below 2 standard deviations impaired. That's just a sort of traditional cutoff in neuropsychology. So here, faces are in black. You can see all but F38 are impaired on this particular test. F38 was impaired on some other tests. Here you can see how they're doing with some non-face classes, so cars and guns. And what you can see here is that they're doing poorly with these tests too. So it's not specific in their case to faces. It also extends to other sorts of categories, which probably isn't surprising because these objects are recognized probably by different mechanisms, but these mechanisms are very close to those that recognize faces. So if you take a hit to one system, it's not surprising that sometimes it affects other systems. And this is an example of a woman that we've tested in London, and she shows a very specific pattern of face impairment. So she's very poor in terms of, so this is the control mean, this is the average here, 0. 2 standard deviations, which is the cutoff. You can see how she's doing with faces. She's doing very poorly. This is famous faces. This can be exaggerated. She really did poorly with those old news too. So she's very bad with faces. And then if we look how she's doing with a number of old new tests with non-face classes, you can see she's doing very well. And interestingly, her dad shows a very similar pattern as she does. That's okay. Let's see. But this. Okay, now I know what to do. So prosopagnosics are the focus here today, but if you can have a selective impairment affecting faces but not objects, it stands to reason that you might see people who have the opposite sort of dissociation. They'll be impaired with objects but not faces. And there's a really famous case named CK, or Mr. CK, who was studied quite a bit by Morris Moscovich in his lab in Toronto. And CK was jogging one day and was hit by a car and suffered brain damage. And that brain damage didn't affect his face processing at all. He can recognize faces just as well as a person with normal face recognition. He's severely impaired with objects, though. So if you show Mr. CK a bottle on a table, he won't know what that bottle is till he puts his hand on it. And so it's not just that he can't distinguish between different bottles. He can't even tell you that it's a bottle. So it's a very, very severe object recognition impairment, and yet he's normal with faces. So there are people who show this opposite dissociation. Very few of them have been documented, though. We published a paper, though, on a woman in Wales, who you see here in blue. She did fine on all the face tests we ran her on. We actually ran her on a few other tests as well. She did fine on all those tests. But then when it came to object tests, she did poorly on a lot of them. She told us in daily life, she said, well, I think I'm fine with faces. We said, well, what about, say, recognizing a car in the car park? And she said, I can do that. That's not a problem. We were a little disappointed. She said, I cover it with bumper stickers, so I can find it every time. So there are people, it appears, who show the opposite sort of dissociation, although it would be nice to find more of them. Now, the neural basis of face processing is an area that's gotten a lot of attention, especially since 1997. In 1997 is when a paper was published that identified what's called the fusiform face area, the FFA. And the FFA is an area that shows an especially strong response. It's back here in the temporal lobe. Shows an especially strong response to faces when compared to other sorts of object classes. Now, that's not the only area that shows this sort of face selective response. There are a number of areas that show it. FFA is the most robust of these areas, so there's been a lot of focus on it. But what I'm going to show you here is a guy named Edward. And Edward's a developmental prosopagnosic who shows a very selective deficit with face processing. He's impaired with faces, normal with objects. And we'll see that that's true not just behaviorally for him, but also when we look at his neural data. So this is just a control subject. It says controls, it actually should say control. But just to give you a feel, this is if we look at somebody's activation in response to places, and then we subtract the activation in response to objects. And you can see there's a lot stronger activation to places than to objects in here. And this is an area called the parahippocampal place area, PPA. Now, if we look at Edward, well, Edward's got a PPA too. Then we take a look at an area called the extrastriate body area. So this is a category selective area that shows an especially strong response to bodies. Well, there's a control. There's Edward. He's got an EBA too. Then if we look at faces, so here's our control. They've got a number of face selective areas. Here's Edward. He doesn't show a single face selective voxel. So it's not just behaviorally that we can see that he's got problems with faces. We can see it neurally. And when we saw this, actually, we thought maybe we'd done something wrong. So, because most developmental prosopagnosics do show face selective activation. I'll show you that in a second. We thought we'd done something wrong, so we got him to come back again. Sure enough, no face selective voxels. Now, this doesn't mean that his brain shows no response to faces. It just means that if you contrast the response to faces to the response to objects, there's no difference. There's no areas that show sort of hot spots, so to speak. Now, this is a paper that we published in the last year or so. Some of you will probably appear on this figure here, actually. This was the study that Lucia and Nick Furl did, looking at structural imaging in developmental prosopagnosics and also functional. This is the functional side of it. So this is just showing behavioral effects here. So these are our control subjects. This is how they do on the Cambridge Face Memory Test, which is a test for those of you who've done it where you learn 6 faces at the start and then you have to try to recognize them. Most of you kind of consider it torture once we get to the second half of the test. This is just a standard famous faces test here. And what you can see is our controls are doing a lot better on these 2 tests than the prosopagnosics are. So that was just to demonstrate that people are prosopagnosic. Now we'll say, well, let's take a look at the fusiform face area and see what's going on in there in prosopagnosics. Now, I showed you Edward already, who showed no face selective activity, but that's very unusual. Here's data. So here in red, I'm sorry if this doesn't show up in the back, but each one of these red dots shows a prosopagnosic. And this shows the contrast between faces and cars. If you're up here, let's say at 4 units here, that shows you show a much stronger response to faces than to cars. If you're down here, if you were at 0, there'd be no difference at all. Well, what you can see is most of these prosopagnosics do have a right fusiform face area, but it's not as selective as the fusiform face area in the controls. So it's just not showing such a strong response in response to faces compared to cars. Over there, this is a different sort of measure, but this is looking at how large the FFA is in people. So here, this is just a number. Voxels are just areas that we refer to. They're units within a brain scan. And so if you have 0 units all the way up to 1,000 units, we can just count how many face-selective voxels you have. What you can see is the prosopagnosics have fewer voxels than the controls. So they're less selective. They're also fewer voxels. So there's just less a neural response to those faces in the prosopagnosics. The same is true in the left FFA as well, although the differences aren't as clear there in the left FFA. Now, the other part of that study, I don't know, let me know when we're running out of it. Okay. The other part of that study was looking at structural differences in developmental prosopagnosics. So that first study was functional. So we're showing people images, and then we say, well, what sort of brain activity do we see in response to those faces? This is the structural study. People just lay it in the scanner, and we're just trying to look, do we see any differences in just the brain structures? And what we found, we did find differences in a number of areas. And fortunately, these differences were in areas sort of that make sense in terms of what we know about face processing. We found structural differences, and the difference we found was less gray matter density in a number of areas within the temporal lobe. We had 2 different types of images that we analyzed. Here you can see bilateral middle STS, that's superior temporal sulcus, which is a sulcus in the temporal lobe. There, out at the end of the temporal lobe, we found differences. These unfortunately don't show up real well. Right posterior STS, and also we found differences in the right middle fusiform gyrus. So we're finding both functional differences and structural differences when we look at prosopagnosics brains. What about aspects of face processing other than identity? Well, this is a real classic model of face processing that was devised in 1986, and there's been a slight update by a guy named Jim Haxby, who I work with now, but we really haven't made all that many advances, actually, since this time. And what you can see in this model is there are a number of different processes that carry out different sorts of face processing functions. And one of the predictions here is that identity processing and expression processing are carried out by different mechanisms. So that suggests there should be some people who show a dissociation between those abilities, good with one, bad with another. Oh, this is Jim's model here. They're similar in many ways. Now, both of these models have a fairly limited number of mechanisms, and it's probably much more sophisticated than any of these models demonstrate. There's just fantastic work going on looking at macaque face processing. Now, and my guess is a lot of the issues that we're dealing with in human face processing are going to first be solved. We're going to understand how face processing works in monkeys, and then we're going to come back to humans and try to figure out based on what we know in monkeys. But it turns out in monkeys, you see 18 face selective areas in them when you do an fMRI scan. And so if you imagine 18 different areas, lots of connections between the different areas, there's a lot of ways that face processing can go wrong. So there are probably all kinds of different types of face processing. Now back to the expression identity thing, we ran 2 tests. Some of you are familiar with these tests. Like in this one, for example, we show you the word confident. We flash 3 faces, boom, 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 each for 500 milliseconds. You have to say which one of those 3 faces is confident. The faces have a little better contrast when you do the actual test here. Here's our data from prosopagnosics. What you can see is, so this is the control mean. This is 2 standard deviations below the control mean. The eyes test is probably a little easy. It's not the most sensitive test. Only one of our prosopagnosics showed an impairment. If we look over at that other test where we flash 3 images, there we find that 4 out of 17, I think it is, prosopagnosics are impaired with facial expression. The others are normal, though. So it shows that just because you're prosopagnosic doesn't mean you can't process other aspects of the face. There are some prosopagnosics who can't do that, but many, probably the majority, appear to be good with other types of face processing. I'll have 2 more slides and then I'll stop. One big question is, what causes developmental prosopagnosia? And we don't have a handle on that question. This is some data from the people actually who participated in that structural imaging study. This was a total of 19 people here. And this just breaks down sort of what these people knew about their relatives. So 21% of them were quite confident that they didn't have any prosopagnosic relatives. They didn't have any family history of prosopagnosia. So what's causing the difficulties there? We don't know. 58% of them, though, reported that they had prosopagnosic relatives. So there, now of course, it doesn't necessarily have to be a genetic cause. They might, have all watched the wrong television show together and they don't have good face processing. But my bet is when you see that, it's because they have some sort of genetic issue. And then there was another 21% that are unsure. So it looks like in many cases there are probably genetic issues at the basis of it, but in other cases we don't know what it is yet. This is our best family of prosopagnosics. People in black here are prosopagnosic. Those in white are not prosopagnosic, and these are all people that I've tested in person. And we've got 8 prosopagnosics here through 4 generations. The way this is, the pattern that you see here is consistent with the gene being a dominant autosomal gene. I don't know that that's actually the case. There are some sort of reasons to be cautious about that. But that at least fits with this data. And I'll stop there because I think I'm running out of time. But I wanted to show one more slide. I was thinking it was here. So the last thing is what sort of disruptions might these genes how might these genes disrupt things so that you don't have normal face processing? And we haven't gotten anywhere with that with prosopagnosia. But if we look to dyslexia, it might provide a nice model. When people do autopsies in dyslexics, what they've found, there haven't been all that many of them done, but what they have done, they've found that often dyslexics show what are called ectopias. So see how there are more little cells here in this region between the 2 arrows down on the other sides? Those are cells that have escaped out into the molecular region of the cortex, or the molecular layer, and they shouldn't have. They should have been further down in the cortex. And so that causes disorganization in that bit of cortex. Now, it turns out that of the 4 genes that have been associated with dyslexia, all 4 of them are involved with neural migration. And so it may be that what these genes are doing is disrupting neural migration. And dyslexia affects an area called, or it affects a number of areas, but one of the areas it affects is the left parasylvian cortex. Well, that's a neural migration problem in that particular part of the brain. One could have neural migration difficulties anywhere in the brain. If the part of the brain that was having those neural migration errors happened to be involved in face processing, then you might get prosopagnosia. So dyslexia and prosopagnosia might be very similar in some regards, just affecting different brain areas. And so I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
In terms of your website survey, is the data pretty sort of smooth in terms of degradation? Is it bimodal? I mean, is there any kind of cut-off, or is it just...
So you're thinking about in terms of severity, whether we see different types?
Or just whether how much is fairly arbitrary where you draw the line versus how much there's a kind of clean cut-off between normal over here and...
There's not a clean cutoff. It's probably a nice normal distribution. When we collect a lot of data, there's certainly it's not bimodal, which is what you're asking. Definitely not.
With reference to this last issue about the dyslexia, I remember about a couple of years ago I heard Andy Ellis talk about something that he and someone called Patrick Moynihan were going to start looking at dyslexia and face recognition in people. Do you know if they...
Not that I know
about that one?
Yeah.
Because it seemed to be going along a similar idea, something to do with corpus callosum stuff, where if you have one you might have done them, but I don't know anyone who's done enough work.
Yeah, what I'm hoping to do is, you can imagine that there could be genes, when we see prosopagnosia appearing in a number of family members, then that suggests that genetic deficit is causing a pretty specific deficit in a particular location. But you can also imagine that there could be genes that are just general susceptibility genes to neural migration problems. And so then what you'd want to do is you want to look in family members of prosopagnosics who are not prosopagnosic and see, do they have elevated rates of other sorts of selective developmental deficits like dyslexia? And so that's one of the things we're hoping to do. Yeah.
I've got prosopagnosia, if that's the word. What I can't understand, if I look in a mirror, I see myself and maybe pre-brain hemorrhage 10 years ago, and then if I see myself on a webcam or when I was on a television program, there's this 65-year-old man. And I can't quite understand why and what I'm seeing and why I'm seeing two different images.
Wish I knew the answer to that. I focus on the simple stuff.
Okay, then. Well, you should focus on me.
Yeah, I noticed there was no studies of DP in the 1980s, and as you have probably heard, prosopagnosics use hair frequently to distinguish people, and the 1980s were the decade of the big hair.
I'm going to put that in the paper.
Change my name.
All right. Well, thanks a lot.